One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dog strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder.
Welcome back to Education in Context, where we interrogate the historical and ideological roots of anti-Black thinking so we can reimagine a world for Black and brown people to do more than just survive, because we know
what we don't name, we normalize.
Now, in our last episode, we explored how language and coded racial rhetoric shape the way society understands Black identity. Today, we move a bit deeper to understand the historical roots of those ideas. Our conversation today is grounded in The Souls of Black Folk, written by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1903. In this foundational text, Du Bois introduces the concept of double consciousness, this experience of constantly seeing oneself through the eyes of a society that devalues Blackness. Du Bois argues that this psychological tension did not emerge naturally. It was produced through the history of slavery, segregation, and educational systems that denied Black people full humanity. Today, we will explore how these ideas still show up in schools, classrooms, and the experiences of Black people today. So let's jump into it.
Let's do it. So I first want to just sit for a second, because what Du Bois is naming here is not just a feeling. It's a systems-produced experience. So today we're not just asking what is double consciousness, we're asking where does it come from? Who sustains it, and where do we see it playing out right now? Du Bois is telling us this isn't internal confusion, this is structural design. You don't develop two-ness unless the world requires you to split.
Yeah, and that takes us to our first quote, which is found on page 3, where it states, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on by amused contempt and pity." So, yeah, exactly. This is a lot to unpack. So the first question that I just want to ask us today is, when do people first learn to see themselves through someone else's gaze?
I feel like we started to talk about this a little bit in one of our previous episodes, that like from a very young age, we start to determine like what the world thinks about us.
Yeah.
And I think the specific language I used was like, when do our babies stop being babies to this world? And I think when the babies stop being babies to the world, it's also when the babies start to view themselves through how the world views them. And I think about, like, look it up on YouTube, y'all, the doll test. I think about that doll test because I'm like, when they present the Black doll, the white doll, and they're asking children across all lines of race and ethnicity, like, which one is the good doll?
Yeah.
Which one is the bad doll?
Yes.
Which one is the ugly doll? Which one is
Yes.
the evil doll? And like over and over again, you're seeing children across all lines of race saying the bad doll is the Black doll, saying the ugly doll is the Black doll. And so that, I think, tells us that from a very young age, we start to internalize ideas about who we are as Black people from a variety of different places.
Yeah. And this word gaze, as we define it, is how others perceive and interpret you based on your assumptions and not truth. And so I think about all of the assumptions that exist, across cultures about different groups of people. I think as a Black boy growing up, there were assumptions that were made about me that were not necessarily true. And I never really questioned it at first, because I think when you're a child, you don't know what you don't know. And you just kind of, go along with it. And then, when your parents also perpetuate by using that language with you, you then internalize those assumptions outside of like TV, music, what you might read, images that you might see.
Yeah, which kind of brings us to that next question of like, what environments teach us which parts of ourselves are acceptable?
Yeah.
Right. And I think you named one of them, like schools, for sure. I think about like churches.
Yep.
I think about everyday mundane places like the grocery store. Like, no, seriously, like if you go to the grocery store and you notice like some people move to the other side of the aisle, or like all of those types of things that are already starting to form for you. What does the world think about me before I even open my mouth? And I also think about like in stores when the like employees are like following you around the store, like all of those
and
types
that's the
of
thing.
yeah,
And
like
that's the
all
thing.
of those things are shaping your identity. And like who you are, what is acceptable, what versions of you are acceptable,
Yeah.
etc.
I actually remember years ago, I was probably a teenager going into a store in Chicago, and it was a music store. And I was just looking at, this is like when CDs were a thing. So it was like super, 10 plus years ago. But when I was in the store, I remember one of the associates like being in the aisle with me, and they were just by me, and that was weird. I had another experience more recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where I lived in a west suburb of Chicago. I was walking down the street. There was a white lady. She was walking down the street, and she crossed the street, and that really happened.
Wow.
I had another experience, actually. I've had a couple of experiences involving being stopped by the police, and they stopping me for, I guess, was no apparent reason because they didn't give me a ticket. But like, I think all of these different experiences that I've had, I think in my younger years, I wasn't able to name what I was experiencing. I think in my older years, I can name this as, oh, okay, you actually have no reason to exhibit this particular behavior, but because you are making assumptions about me right now, because you think that I'm somebody that I'm actually not, you are now, posturing yourself in this way that does not make me feel good.
Yeah, and it's so crazy that you start to name this because it kind of leads to our next question of what does it mean that this awareness often develops before language? And it's like we are already forming exactly what you named, what the world thinks about us before we even have the language to describe what is happening, before we can say this is a microaggression, before we can say this was with a racial intent, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
We are feeling it. We are experiencing it and able to name like, oh, wow. At school, they never called on me and I was the only Black child in the class. Like, what does that mean? Or like the ways in which like I was like excited to answer the question and they tried to like code it as like whatever, like insert X racially charged, whatever. Like, and I think it's like thinking about how we have to be more mindful as people that experience this two-ness, sometimes this three-ness, this four-ness, right? Depending on the different identities that we hold, it can be exhausting. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But before you even have the language to describe, you are feeling the thing.
Yeah, you are. And part of this quote, and it's towards the end of the quote, it says, a world that looks on by amused contempt or pity. And so this idea that there is a conflict that people have with me before I speak, before I show up in a space, simply because of my identity, I am already seen as potentially problematic, difficult, and all of the other like adjectives that people might attach to me simply because of, how I identify. And then just this idea of pity, this idea that some of the things that we experience because of this double, consciousness that we live in is violent, it's sad, it's disgusting, and I think for a Black individual, I always think about like, where do I see this in history that tells me that, oh, okay, this is why I'm experiencing this. And we know the institution of slavery in the United States was a very violent institution. And so that ideology continues to live in all of the other experiences that we have.
And I think when we're thinking about it in schools and we're thinking about our students and pushing them to be like ask themselves those questions, those meta questions about like, why do you think this person just interacted with you this way, right? Without them internalizing it as this being the truth. But I think this is why this word gaze is so important because it is predicated on the fact that this is not about the truth.
Yes.
This is about the perception.
Yes.
And it's so interesting because I just had this conversation the other day with someone about how perception is reality. And I was like, I really hate that term. And I feel like I've said this before in our episodes. I really hate that perception is reality because of the ways in which objectivity is not real. And so if objectivity is not real, it's not possible to be objective, then that means people's subjective perceptions are what they're operating on. And your subjective perception might be absolutely wrong. And you are making all these decisions rooted in that. You might have positions of power making decisions rooted in your assumptions, right? And I think that is a really scary thing to kind of be confronted with.
I do want to take a moment to kind of talk about, this idea that we are also conscious in other ways outside of, our proximity to whiteness as a Black person. And so like I think about my religious upbringing. I grew up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think because of that particular upbringing, I did not fully understand the ways in which racial politics even worked, because it just wasn't a thing that you talk about in that particular religion. It was more so geared towards, what does the Bible teach? What does the Bible say? And all of it, I think, was helpful in my forming of, my core personality. But then I think about, this idea that, man, I actually missed a lot. I missed a lot growing up, thinking that this way of believing in this religious, organization was the only way to think about the world. And then when I left the organization and started to do more reading, more research, I was in college and, took some classes. I'm like, oh, actually, this is actually doesn't even matter right now what I think about God, because people are already judging me because I'm Black, and I think I had some awareness around it, but I think when I left that religion and I was able to think a little bit more clearly about, the way I exist in the world, it became much more clear to me that, oh, okay, my Blackness is impacting opportunities that, people do or don't put in front of you.
Yeah, and I think for me, which something you're naming is around this environment of how religious environments kind of shape what we think is acceptable. And I think about my identity as a Black queer woman, and the ways in which that was never a conversation I could ever have, especially being in a Caribbean household. And if anyone knows anything about Jamaica, there's a lot of homophobic tendencies in music, culture, etc. And so for me, it was this is not even a part of my identity we can even talk about. But I also need to be aware of the ways in which I was finding attraction towards women that I thought were attractive, et cetera. And me downplaying and silencing those parts of myself, because I was just how would I experience shame, et cetera, all of those things with people that I cared about and valued for being myself, right? And so I think that kind of brings us into this next piece of just examining the outcomes. What is the impact of this?
Yes.
And Du Bois' concept of the veil represents not only separation, but distortion. It's a condition where individuals are seen through assumptions rather than realities.
Yeah.
So similarly, on page 3, Du Bois states, the Negro is a sort of seventh son born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world.
As we continue thinking about the question, what happens to people when they are consistently misseen? I think one of the things that's really standing out to me is where he says a world which yields him no true self-consciousness. So when I think about being misseen, I think about I actually am not seen through my Blackness. I am seen through my proximity to whiteness. And that is informed by the way in which I communicate, or the way in which I might dress up, or the way in which I might, take an action or not take an action. And it's just oh, if I take this action, I'm going to be praised because it's closer to whiteness. But if I take this very Black action, I'm going to be criticized, or someone's going to have, a negative comment to make because they do not value the way in which I could culturally show up and do culturally show up.
And honestly, and this is reminding me, I'm smiling because it's reminding me of the conversation that we were having last night around the critique that we were talking white, because I think about, because I just think about how there is Black, the color Black is the absence of color, right?
Yes.
Or something like that. It's not a actual color. It's a hue or something. I don't know. Don't quote me on this.
Yeah.
But the thing I'm thinking about is we often think about how we are supposed to show up as Black people in a binary to whiteness, or if this is white, then this is Black. And I actually don't think that that's real. I think it's something that we determine to try and label stuff, because that's what humans do to have control. And so I think when you said something about proximity to whiteness, it's making me think about every single thing that we are doing is being filtered through how close are we to whiteness, or how much are they trying to show up as a white person, or which is kind of crazy, because it's what were the metrics or the value systems used in Africa before I was even seeing a white person? How do we determine who we are in identity, and why is the definition of ourselves in proximity to what we are not, right?
Yes.
And I think that that's a pretty interesting thing to be thinking about.
Yeah.
So when I think about being misseen, I'm like, wow, Black and brown people are very hyper visible. Like if I walk into a room, everyone's probably looking at me. But I am being interpreted probably through assumptions, biases, etc.
Yeah.
And so like, what does that do to my psyche? What does that do to my mental health? To like constantly have to think about that.
Yeah, I think there was a moment when I was in banking that I really felt that way. I had, towards the end of my banking career, I had just started growing my locks out. I had gotten like lock extensions to help grow my hair. And when I went to work, I remember my manager, supervisor at the time, saying something that didn't affirm me and the way in which I was wearing my hair. And I didn't take it personally, but I think looking back on it, I'm like, man, maybe even in this small way, like the way in which, you know, I now do have full locks was not seen as something that was a professional look in, you know, in the workplace of banking. And so I think about like all of the small ways in which I have to grapple with how I show up. Because I don't want to be seen as something that I'm not. But then I'm also thinking about maybe it doesn't matter because I'm gonna show up the way I'm gonna show up,
Period.
and if you don't like it, that's okay.
Period. And it's so crazy because you shared that example in a professional setting, and I had an experience in college with a friend who was a white woman, and I remember, kind of crazy, because I was just thinking about it like this is so crazy. But I remember I had like in faux locks as well, and I was like, I think I'm gonna really lock my hair. Like this looks good on me. Like and I'm feeling myself, affirming myself as I'm sharing with someone that I thought was a friend and like whatever. And I remember her saying, yeah, you should do that. So then all the guys start talking to me and not you. And I was like, what? Like, but in that moment, I'm thinking like, wow, you are explicitly saying you do not think locks are attractive, and that the world and your interpretation of the world, that the world does not think that locks are attractive.
Yes.
And so you're like, yes, this Black woman has been taking all the attention. Now I'm gonna get the attention. Like it was so crazy to me. I was like, oh wow, this is why I cannot be friends with you anymore. Like, because what? And I think those instances also do something for your psyche because you're like, dang, like, is the natural hair growing out of my head that unattractive that people would stop pursuing me? Like, my face is the same. Like, you know, like, it was so crazy to me having those moments where I was being forcibly made aware of the ways in which people, like, viewed the most, like, natural versions of myself.
But I also think that the fact that people can automatically say that to you and have that response really emphasizes the way in which we are conditioned, we are programmed. Like our culture, American culture, is very much so geared towards anti-Black ways of thinking, and it's so subtle. We don't even, like, I remember when I was in grammar school being called an Oreo, and I celebrated that at first because I didn't really understand what it meant, and I'm just like, oh, Oreo, that means I'm a white person and a Black person's body, I'm smart. That's literally what I was thinking as a child, and I didn't understand that, oh, okay, this thing that's being said to me by this student is actually anti-Black. But when you're younger and when you, again, don't understand and you internalize, you know, the ways in which anti-Blackness shows up in language, you internalize that as part of your identity, you know, you don't think about it. Now that I'm older, I'm always thinking about, man, what did this person say to me? Is this rooted in anti-Blackness? Is this a dig at, you know, my culture or how I look or my identity? If it is, then I need to say something to that person because I need to set that boundary that, you know, this thing is not appropriate and we need to
not do it.
Not do it again.
Period. And it's so crazy because our next question about what does it cost to always translate yourself, I'm just thinking about like how exhausting it is, like in the workplace, in relation, like when you walk into a room, when you go to a bank, and I'm like, dang, I know I got to put my voice up a little octave because otherwise they gonna do too much, right? Like that's crazy to me, but it is our reality. And when I think about like adjusting tone, body language, etc., it is like a part of surviving these spaces. And so when we think about in the beginning, when we did our framing of like, what does it mean to do more than survive? Like why? No, I don't want you to do it anymore. Like, be yourself. Like,
Yeah, be
and I
yourself.
say that to
Be
my
yourself.
coworkers, to my students. Honestly, black, purple, brown, blue. I'm like, be yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Like, be yourself.
Yeah.
Show up whole.
Yeah, I also think, and you said this earlier, that I think it does take a mental toll. I think that, and I think I may have mentioned this when I talked about just like my experience as a Black educator, and even outside of education, when I was working in other industries, like I've always felt like I just needed to be exceptionally well, because if I'm not exceptionally well in everything that I'm doing, then someone is going to find fault, and someone's going to perceive my fault as, being based on the color of my skin, or, the fact that I have tattoos on my arms, or, my locks, whatever it might be. Like you don't have any data to corroborate like the reasons why you think that I might not be fit or able to do something. This is just all based on the assumptions that
Feelings
you
and
continue
vibes.
to have.
Feelings and vibes.
Feelings and vibes, yeah.
Feelings and vibes.
And it's a no.
Period.
It's a
And
no.
it also makes me think about like something that you just named is making me think about how Du Bois' framing of the book feels very for the white gaze. Feels very like,
does.
This is the experience of the Negro, and this is why.
Yeah.
And like, you guys should feel bad because, but it's like, what did Asada say? Appealing to the moral compass of the oppressor, something along those lines of like, why am I trying to convince you of my humanity? That's weird. And who are you for me to be convincing you of my humanity?
Yeah.
And then in addition to that, the goalpost consistently moves. So why are you trying to convince them of your humanity? Because it's going to continue to move.
Yes.
Every time you reach it, move. Like, what are you doing? Like, no, be yourself.
Yeah.
Show up as yourself.
Yeah, there was a part in the book. I think it was like earlier in the book. It talked about this idea that the opposition of Black people in education in the South showed itself in ashes, insult, and blood. And so I think about, when we decide to say something about it, that we get huge backlash, and that sometimes the repercussion is, you're being reprimanded, or you're being fired, or you're being publicly humiliated, or any other, instance where a person does not appreciate that you're actually holding them accountable by saying like, hey, this thing that you said actually is rooted in this way of anti-Black thinking. I'm saying it to you because I find it offensive. And then the response is, because that's uncomfortable here, but I'd rather say the uncomfortable thing than you say that to me again, or say that to somebody else. But then it's like this retribution of, me losing my job, or whatever the retribution act might be. So I always ask myself, when I am in that moment, how am I going to language this, because I'm going to say it to them, but I need to say it to them in a way where they can receive it and they can learn from it, because I'm still going to say it, but I know I have to strategically say it so that they can receive it,
That's real. I also think something that's making me wonder about is like, what is our end goal in trying to teach people that don't look like us about our humanity? Like, what is our end goal in that? And the only reason I'm saying that is because, one, this quote from page 17 where Du Bois says the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia, Africa, America, and the islands of the seas. Like, he's articulated, this is a global issue.
Yes.
And he said this is the issue of the 20th century. He wrote this book in 1903, and we're in 2026, and we're still navigating this, which means, like, is there actually a finish line to, like, convincing people of our humanity? Is that actually where our energy needs to go?
Yeah.
Or does our energy need to go in convincing each other of our humanity?
Yeah.
Right? Like, convincing Black people, you are valuable.
Yeah.
You are important, so that they operate under that lens, as opposed to the like pouring into the black hole of trying to convince non-people of color like we're valuable.
Yeah, no, my thought is that it starts with us. I think we have to be in the kind of culture where we are doing that, and it plays out in everything that makes up our culture. The movies that we produce, the music that we produce, the books that we write, the TV shows that, are on screen, the movies that are on screen, like, and just like the everyday conversations that we have, and I think the public institutions that exist for Black and brown people, HBCUs, being one of them, or any institution that is supporting and advocating for Black people, like we need to consciously cultivate that kind of way of thinking and being with each other first. And I think that is like the beginning of disrupting that culture. Then on a wider scale, when we think about our white counterpart, that we also need to help them interrogate their thinking with. So
for sure. I think that brings us to our next segment of exposing the inequity. And so Du Bois argues that double consciousness involves into a process of ongoing negotiation where individuals adjust behavior, expression, and identity in response to what is rewarded and penalized. So our first question here is, what does success actually require people to prioritize?
Yeah, and when we think about this question, we have our quote from page 8, which says, "He simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face." I think it's good for me to hear this language in describing like the disrespect, I'll use that word,
That's what it is.
is disrespect, being spit upon, being cursed out simply because you are Black, not being able to, pursue an education, not being able to learn how to read and write and do basic math, and then be reprimanded for trying to do that. That's incredibly disgusting to even think about, but I think Du Bois does a really good job just like putting it into perspective. Like these were the physical things that Black people were subjected to post-Emancipation Proclamation. And you would think that after that time period that, Black people would start to have a different experience. But we see that, all of the initiatives that were put into place for that to happen were undermined because there were a group of people in the United States that were mad about losing their enslaved people that were, and that were nervous about the power that the Black electorate would now have in the United States because they're now able to vote. And so thinking about like that and just like the suffering that still continued even after we thought were in a better situation because of the Emancipation Proclamation.
And I think that makes me think about the post-traumatic slave syndrome. I think her name is Dr. Joy DeGruy. Her book, she talks about this because, to your point, Emancipation Proclamation happens. People are like, no more slavery. But we don't actually look at the ways in which slavery permeates beyond the abolishing of slavery, because if we think about here, we're asking the question of like what was rewarded and what was penalized. That is directly rooted from slavery. Like what were slaves whipped for versus what were slaves that got to get put in the house because they did X, Y, and Z. And so how those things now permeate the workplace, permeate social institutions, etc. When we see people assimilating at work because they want the promotion or the same ways in which we see moving closer to whiteness gets you X level of success.
And I think we actually talked about this last night because we talked about a lot last night, but I remember bringing up this idea that, when people were when Black people were enslaved, there was a benefit to assimilating. Of course, I'm going to, talk in this particular way. Of course, I'm going to wear these particular clothes. Of course, I'm going to do this particular thing because I know that my slave master likes this thing. Of course, I'm going to do these things. It was a survival tactic, i.e. double consciousness. And so, like, when I think about today, what does it look like? I'm thinking about my own experience right now as an administrator at the school I work at. What does it look like for me to be consciously aware that I have to challenge myself all the time to help myself, along with other people, disrupt the ways in which they see our Black children. Because we cannot continue to, I guess as an example, removing a child from a classroom is the best way to deal with their misbehavior. And I get it. And I think, a lot of educators will say like, yes, Children are hard to deal with. They can be difficult. And we expect that because they're children, they're learning. I expect them to make mistakes. And I'm always thinking that, at the point that you remove a child from a classroom, you are removing them from the opportunity to learn. And so I'm more interested in, how are you supporting this child proactively, preemptively before we get to removing them? What does that look like? Because when we don't do that, then we, in my mind,
we're telling them you're a problem and you have to be
yes.
removed from this instance.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
I want to push you on saying people ascribe to certain ways of being because it benefited them, because I also think that's the point of the title of this book is the souls of Black folk, and the way in which even when we are ascribing to move closer to whiteness to survive or get some level of success, are we really benefiting because you are losing your soul? Are you really happy? Are you really feeling genuine gratification when you had to literally silence yourself to get access to this success? Probably not. And we see that a lot of times that is just what we see, mental health issues, etc., because you are literally not being yourself to get some semblance of what you think is success or great or whatever. And
it's kind of like selling. It's kind of like selling your soul.
Yep.
You're selling your soul, and was it worth it? Was it worth it? Was it worth it?
Worth it. And so our next question is, what does it mean if someone has to suppress parts of themselves to succeed? And we know what that means, right? We just said that, selling your soul, and it means that people that are in positions of power get to determine what are the ways in which people show up here, and that's always going to be rooted in their anti-Black thinking.
Yeah.
And so I think that is what is so dangerous, is that in hiring phase, in the actual working in the classroom, et cetera, the people that are in positions to determine what is the way we show up and what is the way we don't, often are not doing this level of thinking, are not interrogating the ways that they're complicit in anti-Black policies, practices, et cetera. So then that's communicating to the Black teachers and staff members, you need to silence yourself to exist here, or you won't have a job.
Or you want, and I think there's also just a moment where we actually need to see this as valuable as way of professional development, ongoing anti-racist PD training, because I've been in education for 7 years now, and 7+ years now, and I have had 2, maybe 3, I can't remember. I know I had 2 trainings that felt helpful to me in terms of understanding, my identity, my multiple identities, the privilege that might exist in some of the things that, I identify as, and the ways in which I have to be, mindful of the implicit bias that we bring into spaces. But the fact that I only had 2, maybe 3 trainings like that is problematic. But we always have a training about getting ready for students to take a test or, doing a icebreaker for 25, 30 minutes. That's great. I love the community building. I love the fact that, we're prioritizing professional development in an academic way, because teachers need that. But I think there's a real piece that is always missing in professional development, and that is the implicit bias, the anti-racist training.
And it's so crazy that you said that, because on page 87, Du Bois states, the function of the university is not simply to teach breadwinning or to furnish teachers for the public schools or to be a center of polite society. It is, above all, to be the organ of that fine adjustment between real life and the growing knowledge of life. And so it begs the question of is it too late by the time teachers get into the workforce for us to be doing anti-racist PD? Should it have already been happening in that undergraduate experience, as that's really where we're forming who we are. In college, when we're trying to decide what we want to study, we're reading different texts. That's actually where we should be doing the labor, because then that's what you bring into the workforce. That's what you bring into the real world. And how are we being more intentional on the undergraduate level to ensure that people are being forced to sit with their reality and unlearn certain ways in which they think the world should operate, because otherwise they go into the real world and create policies that perpetuate all of the anti-Black things.
All the anti-Blackness. And that actually gets at our question, why does this make identity formation integral? So we're thinking about this idea of double consciousness. Why does this make identity formation integral during the K through college experience in preparation for life? I would argue that this way of thinking about our world needs to happen before undergrad. Like there should be some kind of curriculum in, primary schools, middle schools, and obviously age appropriate, but throughout our educational life where we are constantly being presented with information that helps us understand how we need to see ourselves in the world and and how the world sees us based on the historical context. And I think that happens in a social studies class. Maybe it happens in a social studies class.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Yeah,
Maybe.
But it actually should be integral to the curriculum, because to all parts of the curriculum, K through, college, because it impacts all parts of the educational experience. If I'm a teacher or a staff member, in the building that is presenting, any kind of languaging or actions that are inherently anti-Black, then I need to have some support within the school system to interrogate that. And the students are also internalizing, anti-Black ways of thinking and being, and we need to support them in interrogating that. And so I think there is a opportunity and a conversation to explore this idea of like this being part of the continuum of like K through college education.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's yes, and I think in the current political climate that we're existing in, as they're like removing DEI from schools from everywhere, right? I think that it's laughable that like they're doing those things as we already were not doing it well enough, and now it's like,
and now they're removing the support that was trying to help us start doing it at all.
And it's just like, that is so interesting to me, because when we're thinking about why does this make identity formation integral, that's literally Du Bois' point, is that like the Negro never gets to actually reach self-consciousness or awareness of who they are, form their identity, because they're never actually doing that mindset work. There's never actually like enough media, social interactions, relational infrastructures that are saying, hey, you are valuable and worth investing in, like, and building the intrinsic value for Black folks, because that would not be what helps them push whatever agenda that they have, right? So I think we have a responsibility to pour into each other, to pour into like other Black folks. Like, no, you actually deserve better than that. I actually don't want you to show up for yourself like that. Like, you actually need to say something, to kind of encourage them to get the language to advocate.
Yeah, in several parts of this book that Du Bois wrote, he talks about the power of civic engagement and voting. And so, we're talking about, our federal and state governments and city governments when we vote. I'm also thinking about, what happens on the local level in your school district. If you are paying attention to, what your students are learning and the human experiences that they're having, like, you might have an opportunity to advocate for that change. And I think Du Bois did a really good job just, emphasizing the idea that our civic duty is to engage in the politics of this moment, because the politicians that are in these positions do have some influence to change the laws that exist, or to create laws to enforce this way of learning and curriculum. But that, only happens when we are voting those people into office that have that agenda and that goal in mind.
And I think it's hard because, like, I feel like, we don't want to get too much into politics, but I feel like, to my point that I was making earlier about the goalposts moving, I always ask myself the question of, like, is that really where our labor is needed? Is like pouring into like voting in the political system? If when policies are passed, we see historically they're repealed, right? We see a different institution created that like recreates the same problem in a different way. So is it actually more advantageous for us to pour into it, like, Black-owned institutions? Is it more advantageous for us to pour into Black political structures? Like, because we want to think about, like, if I don't see you as valuable, I am not invested in your survival, period. So whatever way in which I mask it, whatever politicians that run around and try and say what they're doing for Black folk when it's time for the election, right? Like, it's the truth. Like, that's what happens. And so I think it's like really important for us as a people to actually have a different framing than I think Du Bois had, and like
Yeah.
not convincing anyone external to our communities about whatever, convincing each other that we're worth pouring into, because I think that there's a lot of divisiveness in our communities as a result of us not believing in each other.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if I don't believe in myself, of course I don't believe in you.
Yeah.
Right? And so how are we building the belief?
Yep.
How are we unlearning tropes that we think about each other
Yeah.
within our communities? I think about, like, both of my parents are Black immigrants from the Caribbean, but are very anti-Black American.
Yeah.
And that's rooted in whatever socialization they've had or the things they've heard and seen about Black Americans prior to coming here. And I remember my mom would always like mock Black American vernacular, like Ebonics. And I was like, girl, you speak patois. Like, that's the same thing. You're speaking broken British English. They're speaking broken English. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And she was like, wow, I never thought about, like, they don't have a language. Yeah, girl, that's their language. The same way in which that's your language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, there's just a lack of awareness of, regardless of where you are in the world, in the diaspora, like, we are having a similar experience.
Yeah,
And if
we
we
are.
lean into that as opposed to like crabs in a barrel, we potentially could do more than survive.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I agree. And on page 89 of our text, which reads, "And to make men, we must have ideals, broad, pure, and inspiring, ends of living, not sordid money getting. The worker must work for the glory of his handiwork, not simply for pay. The thinker must think for truth, not for fame. And all this is gained only by human strife and longing, by ceaseless training and education." I think this last part, all of it is beautiful, but I think this last part, ceaseless training, really stands out to me because I always think about, we don't stop learning.
We just said that
and we
last
don't
night.
stop, and we just said we don't stop unlearning. And I think the more that you are committed to doing that work because you want to be better, for yourself and for your students and for the people that you work with, or if you're just a professional in a non-educational sector, you want to be better for the community that you work with, you are going to do that work because we understand that we have grown up in a society that is embedded in all kinds of anti-Black ways of thinking.
And it makes me think about when you said, probably like episode 1 about leaning into fear and discomfort. And like, you have to do that in order to, like what Du Bois is saying here, and choosing work that is actually purpose-filled or like fulfilling for you, and not just choosing work that is rooted in like getting a check.
Yeah.
That is leaning into fear and discomfort, because that's a very courageous thing to do in a capitalist society where everyone's trying to, like, the recession, like all these things that are happening where people are struggling to wake up every day and feed themselves, feed their children, etc. You are leaning into fear and discomfort to be like, I am going to choose truth in this moment, even if it subjects me to X, Y, and Z thing. And a lot of people are not comfortable doing that. And I remember my second year in education, after I left a charter school on the East Coast, I met someone that had also worked at that charter school for a really long time. And they were like, oh, you only worked there for 1 year? I said, yeah, I wasn't aligned to their behavior management system. And I remember him saying, like, yeah, like, actually, this was a few years later because COVID had happened. I remember him saying, like, like post-COVID, a lot of charters have shifted their behavioral management systems because of the critiques about anti-Blackness or whatever. And he was like, it was kind of hard working there for a while. I said, oh, how long did you work there? And then he was like, 6 years. And I was like, 6 years? You observed this and stayed? And then he was like... He was like, well, like, everyone's not like you, like, blah, blah, blah. And I was like me? Like, and I recognized in that moment at that time, like, I didn't have a kid yet, right? So I wasn't, like, responsible for someone else's livelihood, etc. But I feel in my soul, like, I cannot say yes when my truth is no. I cannot say no when my truth is yes. Because it does feel like a selling of my soul. It does feel like a betrayal of self. And so, it is hard to do. And it is, to your point, necessary. And I think that brings us to, like, the envisioning of liberation here. Like, what would it mean to not split? Like, what would spaces look like where people don't have to perform to belong? And so I think Du Bois imagines a possibility beyond fragmentation, where individuals are not forced to choose between identities, but can exist fully without penalty. So if we've been talking about what it means to live split, I think the question here becomes, what would it mean to live whole?
Yeah, and that brings us to our next quote, which is found on page 8. It says, "The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife, this self-conscious manhood to merge his double self into a better and truer self. In this merging, he wishes neither of the older selves to be lost. He would not Africanize America. He would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world." And so, thinking about that question, what would it mean to live whole? I always think about an experience that I had when I was in banking, and I quit. I quit like 3 days and told my manager, like, yeah, I'm not gonna stay, anymore. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I do remember not feeling fulfilled. And interestingly, I enjoyed working in the banking field. I think as a career, it was very, interesting. I was also, still young at the time. So I think working in that field helped me learn a lot of transferable skills that I then took into, other areas of work. But I think that, at year 6 of me working in banking, I just wasn't fulfilled, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I went to Georgia, and I stayed there for a while, and I had an interview with Teach for America. And I think the interview process really inspired me to be like, you want to know it? Because I wasn't sure what my next career was going to be. But when I think about Du Bois's idea of our quote where it talks about being whole and what does that mean in how I maneuver in my life, it means that I am making intentional decisions that help me, feel whole within myself, feel proud about all of the parts of my identity, and not feel like I have to be a different person or present myself a different way because of the institution that I'm associated with. So
Yeah, when I think about this quote, it's making me think about when I was on debate and how like I didn't seek out being on the debate team, but when I got on the debate team, I felt like I had met my thing that I was supposed to do in
yeah,
this life. And
yeah,
and it was because of like the graduate level research I got to do as an undergrad student about these like critical race theory, et cetera. But in addition to that, the specific team that I was on had a history of being disruptors, right? In 2000, they were like starting what we now call alternative debate and incorporating like music, incorporating spoken word poetry, et cetera, into their argumentation in policy rooms,
yeah,
where a lot of times was a lot of mental masturbation and like people just doing things because
yeah,
they're like, I want to say I won this, where they were like, oh no, actually this matters. Like
yeah,
policy affects Black and brown people in this particular way.
yeah,
And it matters that we are having these conversations, that we're forwarding different frameworks, that we're disrupting
yeah,
this thinking in the
yep,
academy,
yep,
because it does spill over. That's the argument, at least, to like when these white boys at Georgetown, Harvard, et cetera, become policymakers, we actually do need to see a difference in the way in which they think about how policy shapes infrastructure, right? And I
yeah,
think that like when I was on debate, I was able to make those arguments, read but be myself and do my pieces, et cetera. And I was like, wow, I get to be all versions of myself. And I'm not called an Oreo. Like I'm not
yep,
I'm not like, and it was crazy because someone has also had a history of like being called that, being in a space where I felt so hyper Black
yeah,
because of how I was showing up and how these people were pissed that I was getting to show up like this and taking ballots and winning.
yeah,
Right. That reminded me of how uncomfortable people are when Black folks show up whole,
yeah,
and how you're going to have to lean into that. You're
yeah,
going to have to like not internalize that,
yeah,
because it's going to be an inevitable thing
yeah. It's
that
gonna be
people will be upset that
yeah.
you're feeling comfortable being yourself.
Yeah. I love that in the beginning of your story that you talked about the other people that you were with that kind of influenced you. And I
Hmm.
think about, sometimes we don't know how to show up as our authentic self because have been taught and habitually have always kind of, silenced ourselves. I remember when I was growing up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, there were a lot of things that I chose not to do that weren't inherently negative or bad, but I just chose not to do it because of my upbringing and the way I was taught to think. And some of them silenced, the cultural parts of myself that I probably would have been more comfortable with being myself in, but I wasn't. And so I think, for you to have a group of people in that way that were like, yes, Chanel, we know that you can do this. We're going to affirm you, and we're going to embrace, the full person that you're bringing to this experience. Do it. I think that's something that needs to always be true when we think about like helping us reconcile this double consciousness that we feel.
Yeah, and I think something you're making me think about is like I remember this one round for debate where the judge was this white man who had been judging in debate for like 20 years. And after the round, we won the round, and he said to me in the reason for decision, he was like, you had me vote on arguments that I would have never voted in my 20 years of being in debate. And that showed me, like, to my push earlier about what does it mean to, like, for something to be more successful or be better or whatever. And I'm like, wow, it was very hard. There was some rounds where I'll be crying because of the things I experienced because people are so anti-Black.
Yeah.
But I was like, when I chose to be myself, no matter how much uncomfortable that was, and I leaned into that discomfort, the result was like this person shifted their mindset in this round in a way in which they had thought this thing for 20 years. Like, that's very freaking powerful,
Yes,
so I'm like, that made me think about, like, even when this thing is hard, and I'm not suggesting at all that we be martyrs, because we don't have a responsibility to be that. But I am saying, like, there is benefit, and like we will shift minds when you are leaning into fear and discomfort, because why would I subject myself to the things I subject myself to when I show up as my full self? If not that be the thing that we should be doing, right? Like,
and the last part of this quote that we read from Du Bois says, for he knows that the Negro blood has a message for the world. And so you choosing, to say whatever you said to that during that debate, to the who was a judge, to the judge there, probably, was a message that he had never heard but was receptive to. And that when you lean into that fear and that discomfort that you talked about, and you with all the courage say the thing, people are going to resonate with that. Because, at the end of the day, when we think about the core of, the message that we read in Du Bois's book, it's about our humanity. It's about the humanity of Black people and us being able to feel that full humanity in all of our experience, and the more that we lean into in community with other people, the more that we lean into, sharing that message that we have about our humanity and how, this is what we bring. This is the value that we bring. This is the information that we bring to this space to make the world better. Then that's when something powerful happens. And I think it's important for all of us that are, it's particularly in education, to also help Black and brown children always see the knowledge that they bring into the classroom as a valuable part of the lesson.
Absolutely. And I think it brings us to this question of, what would it mean to be legible without translation? Like, what would it mean for you to exist in spaces and not have to, like, over communicate who you are? And what would those institutions have to look like? Like, what are your thoughts about that?
I think that there is a lot of unlearning that I think is really important for us to do first. I think that you are not able to begin to create those spaces for yourself if you are still, showing up in a problematic way. And I think that there's been many times, in my career that I have had to tell myself, man, that doesn't feel right, or this thing that I'm doing that I've been taught doesn't feel equitable, and let me push myself to reflect on, what I could do differently. Or let me go to the individual that told me that this was an appropriate thing to do and ask some questions so that maybe we need to unlearn something together so that we can implement something different. But I think that awareness piece is so important when I think about, how I then start to move in a more liberatory way.
That makes sense. And I also think it then begs the question of, like, this is not about, like, better fitting into any system.
Yeah.
This is about like, how do we like unlearn this idea that we have to fit at all?
Yes.
Like, you know, and I think normalizing being yourself and not people changing, but conditions changing. So when we think about, like, to your point, definitions of intelligence or what constitutes as knowledge, if we think about our episode where we talked about like epistemic violence, like how are we interrupting those things so that we can normalize like showing up as your authentic self is welcomed here.
Yes.
And when we create those conditions, people are able to show up as more whole. People are not being forced to split into this two-ness when we create those conditions.
Yeah. I think there is also a part of this conversation where I just want to continue to think about, like, what does this look like systematically? Like, we're having this conversation, but we need to, just like we are very intentional about, you know, the other professional development topics that we think are important to facilitate at the beginning of the year. I think this topic needs to be facilitated at the beginning, in the middle, maybe in the middle of the year. And then at the end, as we think about next year, like, this is an ongoing, what Du Bois emphasized is ceaseless training. We have to continuously reflect on, learn, acquire some knowledge about, so that we can, you know, come out of this way of double conscious thinking and be authentically ourselves, and okay with being authentically ourselves. And people that, you know, see our other way of being because it's culturally, you know, something that we do problematic, you need to interrogate why you see that as problematic, so that you can then affirm the people in these spaces that experiences double consciousness.
Yeah, and I think also being okay being a disruptor.
Yeah.
Like, I'm perfectly fine being like, why did that make you uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Right? Like, so that they can, to your point, interrogate that and naming like, hey, like, your feelings about that really don't impact me at all. And like the way in which you disarm people who feel like they're going to shame you into compliance or like shame you into conforming. Like, no, actually, I'm going to show up like this and I'm going to outperform you still. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm going to be my Black self and I'm still going to outperform you.
I bet on myself. I'm going to win. If I lose, I'm still winning, because I'm going to learn from it and I'm going to win. Like, like we always take that mentality into the space. There is a quote on page 15 when we think about how we move into a more liberatory way of being. It states, freedom, 2, the long sought, we still seek, the freedom of life and limb, the freedom to work and think, the freedom to love and aspire, work, culture, liberty. All these we need, but not singly, but together. I think this really encompasses, like, you know, the end goal here, that we just, you know, as Black people, as brown people, just want to exist in a society where we don't feel like, and I've said this before, I have to cross my T's and dot my I's and triple think about or second guess what I've just said or done. That is, and there's nothing wrong with it. And I think that is, you know, for me, has been interesting for me to reflect differently about as I'm getting older, and as, you know, my career continues to evolve in education. You know, what does it mean for me to, or what do I have to do for me to see this, for me to feel free in my life, for me to feel free at work, for me to feel free in the way that I think, for me to feel free in the way that I love people. Like, I think that is something I'm still, like, constantly reflecting on. Like, how does that show up in my actions every day?
Yeah, and I think you made a really great point earlier about, like, this is an ongoing process, right? Like, I don't think in our lifetime we will ever see these things change, because 1903 this book was written, and in 2026 this book is still relevant.
Yes.
But what I do think that we should hyper focus on is within our own communities, within the institutions that we're in. How are we doing those things? Because you might shift someone's thinking and that impact their path in life, et cetera, right?
Yeah.
Like, and those are the small ways in which we can create pockets of liberation, as opposed to like fully being liberated and like liberating ourselves from all these systems that we exist in.
Yeah.
What does it look like to create a more liberation-aligned life within my community, within my school, within my church, within et cetera? And I think that leads us to like our call to action.
Yeah. And so, our call to action this week is for all of our audience members to notice one moment, just one, where you adjusted yourself to be accepted. I want you to ask yourself, did I do that because it felt right or because it felt necessary? Also want you to pay attention to the people around you. When someone shows up differently, pause before you interpret it. Ask yourself, am I seeing them clearly or am I seeing them through the assumptions that I have been taught to believe about this particular group of people? Also think about, what is this space actually rewarding that I'm in, where I'm having this conversation or dialogue with myself? Who's getting affirmed in the moment and who's getting corrected? After you do all of that, I want you to name the thing. I want you to interrupt the thing, and I don't want you to move past it. Don't avoid it. Address it. As we close out, I want to invite everyone that's listening to this discussion to sit with the tension that Du Bois names, the idea of living with two-ness, of constantly navigating how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. If you enjoyed this conversation, please bring it to your classrooms, bring it to your families, bring it to your friends. If you have any comments about this idea of double consciousness, please, please, please use the hashtag EducationInContext. This was a great conversation.
Yes, and I just want to say, think about like every space you are in. What are we rewarding? What are we correcting? How are we interrupting it? Because it starts with these everyday interpersonal interactions, conversations at a hookah bar, conversations in our living rooms. Like, these are the moments to unlearn and kind of decolonize our minds around what does it mean to like exist and be fully ourselves.
Because what we don't name,
we normalize.
We normalize it. And with that said, thank you for being with us for this conversation. Again, if you'd like to join this conversation, please go to educationincontext.org. Thank you.